Hello, I'm Senator Mark Warner, and appreciate the opportunity to share a few comments about Black History Month. I think it's terribly important that we tell the whole story of Virginia and America. And part of that story was the history and circumstances surrounding Daniel Dangerfield, who was an escaped slave who went to Pennsylvania and literally had to fight for his freedom within the Pennsylvania court system, trying not to be returned under the Fugitive Slave Act. The representation of his story at the Aldie Mill is an important step in making sure that all Americans, all Virginians, understand our challenge history with systemic racism in our country. We've seen that, and not just in our history, but we've seen it in our recent past. During the past year, 2020, COVID-19 disproportionately struck our Black and brown communities. We saw it with the brutal murder of George Floyd and the taking to the streets of people of all races to call for racial reconciliation and racial justice. It's an issue that I'm proud that President Biden, Vice President Harris have taken on in terms of equity, racial equity, for our country going forward. It's something I'm proud to have fought for in the most recent COVID relief bill, where I helped secure over $12 billion to make record investments in those lending institutions that lend to Black and brown businesses that got disproportionately hurt again during COVID. 440,000 Black businesses shut their doors during COVID. Without additional help, we'll have a generation of lost wealth accumulation. I'm hopeful going forward, but I do think during the month of February, and for that matter throughout the year, we need to reflect upon the enormous contribution that Black Americans have made in building our country. In many ways, oftentimes through the forced labor of enslaved people, individuals like Daniel Dangerfield. So I appreciate Nova Parks and so many of our friends in Loudoun County for making sure that this part of America's history is brought to the forefront. I believe we should reflect upon these stories and our, again, challenge history with race, not just during February, but throughout the whole year, and continue to build towards a stronger and more inclusive America. Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Phyllis Randall. I'm Chair-at-Large of Loudoun County, Virginia. I want to first thank Nova Parks for bringing us together today to talk about Daniel Dangerfield. You know, upon my election, I became the first person of color to be an elected chair in the entire Commonwealth of Virginia. When I think about that, I think about all the people who came before me, who set down a path for me to walk on. Mr. Dangerfield was certainly one of those people. At a very, very young age, just in his 20s, he made the decision that being an enslaved person, being someone else's property, was not something that he could countenance. So he left, he ran. And I just can't imagine the fear that that young man had to feel, both making the trip, but also being in Philadelphia all those years and knowing that at any time, because of the 1950 Act to return enslaved people, he could be recaptured and sent home. The bravery it took for him, the tenaciousness it took for him is astounding to just think about. And when you read his story, when you read about the trial that happened in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, to send him back, what you read is that the courtroom was packed with people, mostly abolitionists, but packed with people who knew that the evils of slavery were so great that they would stand there and say that they knew this man, this young man, before 1954, to avoid him being sent back. It actually says that the judge on that day looked up, looked around the room, looked at all the abolitionists, looked at people of both colors, African American people, white people, and decided that he was not going to send this young man back. And that night they had a lamp parade. They hoisted Mr. Dangerfield on their shoulders and walked around the area with him to talk about the importance. But what's really amazing is even after that happened, young Mr. Dangerfield knew he still was not safe. And to be safe, to raise his family in a safe place, he had to go even further. So they went to Canada, where they finally settled in Ontario, Canada. because they knew that being anywhere in this country before 1965 would still put them in danger. Think about all that that young man went through. Think about every decision he made, because every single decision he made, every decision so many people made, people names we know and names we'll never know, but all those decisions, all those individual decisions were individual bricks laid down on a path that allowed me to walk on that path, to run for chair, and to become the first chair of color in the Commonwealth of Virginia. If I could see Mr. Dangerfield today, I would look at him and just, well, I guess probably first ask for his autograph, but also then say a prayer with him and thank him for what he did. I wonder sometimes if all those early freedom fighters are looking down from heaven and recognizing that they did this for us, that they have an African American chair, that we have an African American vice president, that we had an African American president. It wouldn't have happened without them. It is because of them. I am who I am because Daniel Dangerfield was who he was. Thank you for letting me be here today.
Good morning, I'm Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton from Virginia's 10th District. Thank you for having me here today. It's so important to me to be here today to honor Daniel Dangerfield during Black History Month, a time to recognize and recommit ourselves to work that needs to be done to reach full equity and justice right here in our own community. Virginia knows all too well our country's original sin of slavery. Enslaved Africans were brought to Jamestown more than 400 years ago. It was not long ago that abolitionists like Daniel Dangerfield escaped slavery right here in Loudoun County. We still travel some of the same roads and trails that many took to flee. Daniel's story of perseverance and courage is remarkable. What stands out most to me are the actions in the Philadelphia courthouse after Daniel was captured and tried before the Fugitive Slave Commissioners. The courtroom was packed. Black and white community members showed up in force to protest the injustice being done to Daniel. Those who attended credit this public demonstration, which shocked the commissioner, as the reason Daniel was let go. The power of public protests by so many members of the community, even and especially by those who have not been directly impacted, was what helped Daniel attain justice. I believe his story imparts an important lesson for us today as we face a long overdue reckoning on racial injustice in America. Since the last Black History Month, we witnessed the killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and too many others. Just weeks ago, we experienced a violent insurrection at the Capitol aimed at overturning the votes of Black and brown Americans in Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. It was appalling and alarming. Those events reminded us that we all have a responsibility to speak out against the injustices we see, and it's just as important now as it was to defend Daniel's freedom in the 1850s. Sometimes speaking out means joining a march, a protest, or a movement to commemorate events and people who haven't received the recognition due through the years. Sometimes it means writing to your elected officials about legislation that's important to you. For me, that includes marching alongside others for racial and social justice last summer. It means successfully working to remove Virginia's statue of Robert E. Lee from the U.S. Capitol. It means fighting to remedy disparities in healthcare and support for minority and small businesses during this pandemic. And it means supporting legislation like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act in our new Congress. We must continue to address our country and Commonwealth's history and legacy of racial injustice. Honoring stories like Daniel Dangerfield's as we are today are an essential step in that fight. I promise to continue to be an ally and a voice for justice and equity in America. Thank you so much.
Good morning. My name is Kate McGinnis Wyatt. I have had the privilege of serving the citizens of Loudoun on the Noga Parks Board for the past 6 years, and the honor of being selected as chair recently. Noga Parks is a unique organization that was created 60 years ago by visionaries who now comprise 6 jurisdictions that create Northern Virginia. They realized if they worked collaboratively and pooled their resources, they could create public spaces for every citizen larger and finer than any one of them could build individually. Today, 60 years later, Nova Parks is a national leader in creating special places for our citizens, wondrous places to go and explore, places to gather and create memories in our beautiful venues, places that share our history. Today, we share and embrace a part of our history too often not told. Today, it is an honor to unveil the plaque that recognizes a true American hero. Daniel Dangerfield, a young man who worked right here, stood for freedom. He stood to uphold the Constitution for every American. He risked his life to ensure our Constitution lived up to its responsibility. When he fled, as so eloquently noted by Congressman Wexton and Chair Randall, he risked everything. His trial was, in fact, basically put into very clear focus the diversion of our country at that time. It enraged Southerners, emboldened abolitionists, and it was part of our American narrative, a narrative which sadly, for over 250 years, has not been told. A narrative directly tied to the events last June at our very own Algonquin Park here in Loudoun County, where 2,000 people gathered to express the importance that Black lives matter. This narrative must continue. Those who fail to embrace our Constitution and the imperative rights given to all are undermining the underpinnings of our Constitution. I'm so proud of Nova Parks for standing strong and ensuring that these stories are told. And we want to invite every person to come to Aldie Mill, stand in Daniel's footsteps, see if you can be as brave as he, and ensure that you play your part in upholding our Constitution for all. And I also want to thank all the brilliant researchers who brought these stories to our rich American history. Thank you.
1, 2, 3. Yay!